So triangle pose, trikonasana, is one of the trickiest poses for new teachers, veteran teachers alike to teach properly. So I wanted to take a few moments to share some of the images I use, some of the words I use, the cues I use, and see if that could help you out. So the most important action of trikonasana is the external rotation of the front leg. So this is true for Warrior Two, Parshvakonasana side angle, and Trikonasana, Ardha Chandrasana, and tree pose. It's really a lot about what's going on at this hip. So it matters where you start. For me, the easiest pose to teach triangle pose from is Warrior Two, because you already have the students in this nice long stance where they're thinking about working the external rotation of their front thigh. So let's take a look. What I like to tell my students to do is to, with their knee bent, because then you can line up the leg a little bit better, is to imagine that you've got a ribbon running from your inner thigh to your outer thigh, wrapping all the way around the thigh bone. So we're really externally rotating the front thigh as much as we can in the hip socket. Another image that you could use, that I like to use, is to imagine that the thigh is like on a big steering wheel, or like you're steering a ship, and to wrap it open. So once they've got the thigh externally rotated and the knee anchored over the ankle, at that point then they also need to turn their pelvis. I use the word towards the side of the mat. So I don't say square your pelvis, because that's going to drop their front knee in. Rather, turn your pelvis towards the side of your mat and press the back thigh back. By doing these two actions, wrapping the sitting bone down, pressing the back thigh back, your students are going to create the most external rotation for their particular body. And then keeping that to root down through the inside of the front foot as you straighten the front leg. And I often use an image when we straighten the leg of pulling stockings up the leg or pulling up a wetsuit, anything that really gets them to suction this thigh bone up and into the pelvis. And as they do this, to keep pulling the outer hip back and underneath them. So I'll say pull the sitting bone back, pull the butt cheek back, deepen the top of the hip crease, shift your hips to the back of your mat. Now notice that I tell them to shift their hips. I don't use the cue to bring your hand to the floor or to lengthen your arm forward or, move your waist, because those are the things that aren't really moving. The movement is coming from the pelvis. So cue, shift the hips back. And then from there, you bring your hand either onto your shin or more likely to a block to the outside of the front foot. One of the other important cues that I like to use here is to keep a little bend through the back of the front knee to prevent your students who are very mobile from hyperextending. And one of my favorite cues for Trikonasana is to tell students to press into the inner edge of their foot as they pull their back hip, as they pull their outer hip back and underneath them. So that creates an action of pushing into the ball of the foot, which will help prevent hyperextension, but at the same time finding this rebounding action up. To come out, I will almost always cue my students to bend their knee first. I prefer that. And then come all the way back up to stand. Now with triangle pose, you can do it two different ways. You can either have quite a long stance, and this is more of the Iyengar style of triangle pose, or you might prefer to teach it with a shorter stance. This gives them a little less space, but sometimes can feel more stable. So depending on where you're going in your class and in your sequence, you can choose which version of triangle to do. But remember, key points: really finding and anchoring students in that external rotation of their thigh first. And then when you're straightening the leg, a little softening behind the knee, press the top of the shin forward, press into the big toe mount. That just helps to keep the knee from hyperextending. All right, so I hope these tips have been helpful for you, and thanks for watching.